What up, Wizards? It's Dev. Yes, he of the uneven front-to-back hair distribution, sort of an ultra mullet, but today is a special day. You see, Wizards is going to do the pre-release for New Capenna in paper before they release the set on Arena. That's a decision I can get behind. It kind of defeats the purpose of a pre-release when you can play with the cards before the pre-release. It always bugs me, but they're going to do the pre-release in paper like a week before the set comes out on Arena this time around. That's a move that's going to really help out LGSs, and I can get behind that, but it also means that a lot of people are going to be going to pre-release for the first time in a really long time. Matter of fact, I imagine a lot of people that have been playing Arena for a year or two now are probably going to be attending their very first paper pre-release ever with New Capenna, so I figured now would be a good time to dust off an old favorite and do one of our once world-famous, ultra-comprehensive, impossibly in-depth, super thorough pre-release guides. Now, since so many people are probably going to be attending their first pre-release this time around, I'm going to be even more impossibly thorough than usual and start with a quick primer on exactly what Sealed is as a format and what to expect from this Sealed event. Now, first of all, just like all Sealed events, you're going to get 6 packs of Magic cards, but this time around, one of those packs is going to be what they're calling a family pack. And when you sign up for the event, you're going to pick what family you want to represent, basically, and you'll be given a pre-release pack coded to that family, and that pre-release pack is going to have 5 normal draft packs for the set, and then again, 1 family pack that's going to be specifically sorted to help you play with that family. Now, how they're going to achieve that is not only will the family packs include a bunch of cards from that family that you chose, but you'll also get 2 lands. You could get the common level sack lands that look like Evolving Wilds that gain life. You could get a Triome. They're not called Triomes in the set, but they're Triomes. That's about as good as you can do. Or, middle option, you might get this dual land that sacks to draw a card later on in the game. But look for these not only in your family pack, but also in your packs at large, because anything to help you fix your mana is going to be very important in this 3-color environment. But remember that you can play 2 colors if you want to, and no one's going to say that you're cheating. For example, I'll get into this a little bit later, probably much later in the video as we wrap things up, but I do think the kind of meta this Sealed looks like largely is the kind where a 2-color sort of aggro deck could probably take advantage of a lot of other decks. So just keep that in mind. But what I want to do first and foremost here, before we really get into anything else, is go over the 5 families quickly, talk about what they do, and some cards to look out for from those families. Now, the first guild that I want to look at, or I guess we're calling them families this time around. The first family I want to look at is Obscura. Us boomers used to call it Esper. This is the blue, black, and white guild. It leans heavily on the connive mechanic, which is good for making your creatures bigger and churning through your deck, both things that are probably typically good in the Sealed environment. Next one I want to talk about is the Maestros, or perhaps Maestros guild. The word is often pronounced Maestros, but, Wizards is weird, so I don't know. But this is as old-timers would call it, Grixis from time to time, the blue, black, and red guild. This one leans heavily on the mechanic Casualty, which allows you to sacrifice creatures, usually to double the effect of spells. Up next are the Riveteers, the black, green, and red family, and my least favorite name for a new family, not only because I kind of think Riveteers is just kind of dumb compared to the other names, but also because it supplants the Jund name, which I am very fond of. But this guild family, I keep doing that, this family does like to sacrifice creatures, but they are easily one of the more aggressive guilds on New Capenna, and they mostly lean on the Blitz mechanic, which allows you to play creatures which have haste, but sacrifice it into turn and draw a card. Up next are the Cabaretti, which is my favorite new guild to say, at least the Cabaretti. But anyway, they are the Naya guild, red, green, and white, and they focus on the alliance mechanic, one that I like a lot. This triggers whenever creatures come into play on your side, and there's a lot of ways to abuse this mechanic. And the Cabaretti guild does tend to have a lot of cards that put token creatures into play to help proc this mechanic. Finally, there's the Brokers Guild, which also feels like a lazy name for a family, but this is the Bant family, blue, green, and white. They lean heavily on shield counters as a mechanic, which are a functional form of sort of hexproof, sort of indestructible, more indestructible than anything. If the creature would be dealt damage or destroyed, instead you take the shield counter off of it. And now that we briefly talked about the 5 families, what colors they are, what they do, what mechanics they care about, all that, let's go through some cards that I want you to be looking for in each of these families. And as usual, in case maybe you're not used to these pre-release guides yet, I'm not going to be looking at rares and mythics. It's basically impossible to game plan around getting specific rares and mythics, even in these like 3-color centric sets where you tend to get guild or family packs. Even with that concession, it is incredibly hard and kind of a fool's game to game plan around getting a specific rare or mythic. Commons and uncommons, though, it's much more likely you'll see, so those tend to be the ones that I point out. Now to start with, each family has a 3-color charm that you can cast at instant speed, and all of these are pretty good, but not all charms are created equal. As far as Obscura goes, you got a pretty good charm here that is not only removal, but can also get you a card back from your graveyard or counter an instant or sorcery, which is important for protecting against the removal spells that you know your opponents are going to be playing, considering those are at such a premium in Sealed. Each family also gets an uncommon legend that you want to be on the lookout for, and as far as Obscura goes, it gets Keza or Queza, I'm not quite sure, but this is a 4-mana legend that procs whenever you draw a card, you basically get to drain your opponent, which is pretty slick, and I can see this being a form of reach in long games of Sealed. Games of Sealed sometimes tend to go quite long, they become stalemates and, board presence situations that take multiple turns. So in that situation, I could basically see this being a way to win the game over multiple turns. So even though I wouldn't, again, game plan too much around this winning a game for you, it certainly can in the long run, so I'd be on the lookout for it. As far as something else that all of the different guilds get, they all get an uncommon that isn't legendary, but is a good creature that you definitely want to be looking for. As far as Obscura goes, you get Nimble Larcenist. Now, this probably isn't as good in Sealed as it might be in Constructed, because in Sealed, it might not get too much out of your opponent's hand. But that said, you can still grab a removal spell. Again, you know they're going to be playing those. And it's a flying creature at a halfway decent rate, which is always going to be valuable in Sealed. Now, as far as the Maestro's Guild, their charm looks very good as well. This has a great removal mode on it and also a great card selection mode. That middle mode that allows you to drain 3 is not going to be super useful, but this could be a decent form of reach in the late game to bolt your opponent for the win. But one way or the other, the top and bottom modes are both incredible on this. And even though you're going to want to play the charm in whatever family you pick if you get the charm, these first 2 charms are some of the better looking charms, especially in the Sealed environment, so keep an eye out for those. As far as the Grixis or Maestros legend, you get Cormella, the most beautiful woman in WWE, but also a decent card. The way I like to look at the last ability on this that gets an instant or sorcery back when this card dies is that this allows you to basically draw a removal spell out of your graveyard, which again is pretty important in Sealed. Now, the uncommon Maestro's creature that only costs 3 mana is Corpse Appraiser, and this is a very good creature. It's only 3 mana for a 3/3, and in Sealed, that's a decent rate, even at a difficult-to-cast mana cost. But the real value here is the fact that you effectively get to strategic planning or impulse or whatever for a card when it comes into play, which is unbelievable value in Sealed. Play this guy if you get him. I think he's more generically good than a card like Nimble Larcenist, even without the flying. But we'll move on to Riveteers. This has a charm as well that has a removal mode on it, but I don't like the removal mode quite as much as the first 2 charms. That said, still a perfectly playable charm, even if some of the modes on it aren't as good in Sealed as the first 2 charms that we've looked at. Now, the uncommon legend is Mr. Orfeo, which is really good if you got some fat guys, and that shouldn't be hard to get in the Riveteers Guild. As far as their uncommon thing, that's Crew Captain, which is one of the most aggressive looking creatures at a lower rarity in the entire set. I say if you're trying to play aggressive, and if you're Riveteers, you probably are, you need to play every copy of this that you can get too, because in the lower rarities, again, this is probably one of the most aggressive and hard to deal with creatures in the format. Now, I like the Cabaretti's charm because it can put a couple of creatures into play, and that's something Cabaretti really wants to do. It also really benefits a large board full of small creatures that has gone wide. That second mode is going to be much better for finishing games than you think it is. As a matter of fact, I think on all of the charms, this is probably the best mode for finishing games of Limited. So keep that in mind. A lot of people poo-poo on the second mode in Standard, but in Sealed, I think it's actually a phenomenal ability. And the first ability, it goes pretty well with the fact that you're trying to go wide in Cabaretti, but it's not as near as good of a removal spell as some of the other charms, but it's still very, very playable. As far as the Cabaretti's uncommon legend, you get Rocco, which, if you have enough mana, can go and get your big bomb creature, your best, 3 or 4 mana guy. that you really were excited about getting in your sealed pool. And just put them into play, which is a good thing to do. This is also decent in long games of Limited where you're able to get a lot of mana out. But remember, if you want to get your 6-drop with this, you have to have like 9 mana sources. That is half of the lands in your sealed deck. You're playing a 40-card deck with 17 or 18 lands. So if you want 9 lands or something, that's half of your of your lands. So don't go too Magical Christmas Land with this. You're probably mostly going to be getting 2 and 3 drops with Rocco, but that's still good. And their uncommon non-legend creature in Cabaretti is Brazen Upstart, which is a decent creature. I don't love the stats on this, but I do like that it's an uncommon guy that, much like Corpse Appraiser, kind of draws you into another creature and gets you closer to the bomb that you got. Now, the Brokers have a great-looking charm for standard play, far as I can tell, but it's still pretty good in sealed, too. This has a decent removal mode on it, provided that you have an okay creature. And it also has draw 2 cards on it, which is fine at instant speed for 3 mana. You'll take a divination effect in sealed some of the time, especially in sort of slower decks. So even though, again, this isn't on the level of, I think, Obscura Charm, for instance, it is still capable of doing some incredible things for you in sealed, so you play the card. Removal is good. Plus, when you can do other things with your removal, that's even better. But they also get Lagrea, which is a removal spell in and of itself, the uncommon legend here, which has really garnered a lot of confusion. I had to cut this part out of a preview video because at the time I wasn't sure exactly what the card did. Can it wrath your opponent's entire board? No, it can't do that. You basically have to choose a creature controlled by your opponent and a creature controlled by you. It's a little difficult to play, especially on curve, for this mana cost, but it's still 3 mana for effectively exile target creature for as long as it's in play, and that is a card you really, really want. So Lagrea is probably one of the better, or it could be Lagrella, but Lagrea is probably one of the better of these uncommon legends just because she's a removal piece and you want to play those. They also get Disciplined Duelist in this family, which is pretty decent. Double Strike is a typically very good ability in sealed if you can put things like auras or anthem effects on this, but if you do have a copy or 2 of this out, I wouldn't be necessarily tricked into playing auras, which are famously bad in sealed. They tend to 2-for-1 you when your opponent points 1 removal spell at your guy and takes out your 2-card investment. But this is a little bit better, right? This gets a shield counter, so your opponent effectively has to maybe block it in combat, effectively throw a trump in front of it to get that shield counter off of it, and then use the removal spell. So your opponent has to work for it, but I still worry this card is a bit of a trap. It's a thing that wants you to play auras on it, and then you still get 2-for-1 anyway. So I'll say that the card is probably good, and effectively 4 power, a double striking 2 power, 3 mana guy is okay, but I'm a little bit more reticent about this than I am about some of the ones that get you immediate value when they enter the battlefield. Lastly, all of the guilds also get a fixer cycle. They look like this. They're different, by the way. All of these are quite different, so I'll kind of cycle them up on screen as I talk about them, but I think that you're probably extremely likely to get these in your family pack, and I do think that they're worth playing, right? You can do the ability at instant speed, and it basically turns one of your lands into a Triome, which you really want, I think. I think these are specifically tuned to help you get your mana in sealed without actually losing you anything because, you pay the 2 mana to turn one of your lands into a triple land. And then later on in the game, you still get to play the creature anyway. So I think these are more than worth playing in sealed, although I don't think they're very great for anything outside of limited. I think they're very good in this environment. So do play these, I think, when you get them, even though Esper has like a 7 mana one that you very likely won't ever get to. There are a lot of these that are very much worth playing. Now, the last thing I'll say about these families before we get into the individual colors and the best commons and uncommons in those, and I think this is very important to say, is think about how these families mix and match with one another. Now, some do and some don't, right? Like the Cabaretti Guild likes to put a lot of small creatures on the table, expand its board, and go wide, right? Well, both Riveteers to an extent, but especially the Grixis Guild, the Maestros, care about sacrificing creatures, so they tend to go somewhat well when you compare them together. Now, I wouldn't play 4 colors. I'm not saying to do that. I would probably play 2 colors and then a very light 3 to 5 card splash of the 3rd color in my family, only the best cards, the removal, the big bombs and stuff like that in that 3rd color. But remember that there are a lot of, monocolored cards that might be technically Cabaretti family, but they play really well with Maestros. Meanwhile, you might not want to sacrifice your creatures with shield counters from the Brokers Guild to your, casualty effects in Maestros. You might not want to sacrifice a connive creature that you put 3 counters on. You've been working on it all game. Again, to one of those Maestro's effects. So I think some of these families play better with one another than others do. So just keep all of that in mind. Some of these family synergies between one another seem to be very good. For instance, one more example is that the Brokers Guild not only has creatures with shield counters, but it can also put shield counters on creatures with a number of cards. So if you have been working on a connive creature all game, you've gotten it up to 5 power, you've connived 3 times, dumped a couple of important cards in your graveyard, whatever, you can then protect that creature with shield counters from Brokers. So there's a lot of very important synergies between these 3 guilds, or 5 guilds, to think about. But now let's get into the individual colors, and what I want to do here is talk about my 3 favorite commons and uncommons from each color. Often I'll do my 5 favorite commons and uncommons from each color, but this is a 3-color set with lots of gold cards, a lot of the powers in the gold cards. So a lot of the power level in the monocolored cards has dipped to an extent, right? So it's hard to find 5 monocolored cards that I really want to point out in each color, but I can definitely find 3 in each rarity. So let's start with white in the color pie here and talk about my 3 favorite commons in white that I want you to look out for. Now, I like Rafine's Informant, Celebrity Fencer, and Inspiring Overseer here. I like that these are all just kind of generically good cards, but in some ways they play well with the themes in the set, right? Rafine's Informant is a connive creature, so if you're playing in the Obscura Guild, you probably want to play this, but connive is just, again, a generically good ability, and I like the way this plays in pretty much any family that has access to white. It's just a fine card that feels like it's, in some ways better than the Explorer ability. It's like a Merfolk Branchwalker, but again, in a lot of ways better. But also like Celebrity Fencer, this plays specifically well with the Cabaretti sort of go wide strategy, but it's also decent with Obscura, which plays a number of decent creatures, Riveteers, which plays a lot of decent creatures. So again, if you're sort of mixing and matching or going into wedges rather than shards, if you want to play Mardu, for instance, you want to play Mardu with some Obscura cards and some Cabaretti cards, again, then I could see Celebrity Fencer being sort of a signpost common for some of those mixing and matching decks, and just specifically the Cabaretti deck. But there's also Inspiring Overseer, the most generically good of all of these cards, right? It's a Windrake, doesn't have the 2 toughness, but it's basically a 3-mana, 2-power flyer, which we call Windrakes in Sealed. But it also gives you a card and a life when it comes into play, which are just unbelievable value at the common rarity. Play these when you get them. As far as the uncommons in white go, I like Rumor Gatherer, as well as Mage's Attendant and Knockout Blow. Now, Rumor Gatherer, keep in mind, it's always going to scry you a card when you play a creature. But a lot of these Cabaretti cards that put multiple creatures into play, a creature and a token, or 2 tokens, or whatever, this is going to immediately proc twice and draw you the card. However, keep in mind that this is double white pips, so I think you have to be very heavily in white to play this card. You obviously don't want to, well, let me say it this way. You want to be careful playing this card in a 3-color deck, because it's going to be relatively difficult to cast in Sealed, but I do think that it's worth making the investment for. Mage's Attendant has garnered a lot of attention in Standard, but I do think it's just as good in Sealed, or even better in some ways. I'm not even really looking at the Mana Tithe ability, which will come into play sometimes. Countering an opponent's spell is important and all that, but what I really like about this is that it's 3 mana for 4 power on 2 bodies. So that's important for Cabaretti. I should also mention, again, that these Cabaretti creatures that create tokens are good to play alongside with Maestro stuff that you sacrifice to Casualty. So this is good for Cabaretti, it's good for Maestros, it's good for a lot of different sort of decks in this format. And in general, it just puts a lot of power and toughness on the board and gives you a ton of board presence for a relatively low cost. It's just a good card. But aside from that, Knockout Blow is just good removal. And I need to point out good removal when I can, because from what I can tell, there is not quite as much good or easy to cast or lower rarity removal in this set as you would normally see. And I think that might have a huge effect on Limited. Now in blue, some commons that I really like are Obscura Initiate, Broker's Veteran, and I guess Echo Inspector if I had to choose another one. Echo Inspector is 4 mana for a 2/3, but sometimes it's going to be 4 mana for a 3/4 flying, which are actually very passable stats, especially when you consider that it drew you a card. These ETB Connive creatures all look to be somewhat heavily costed in this set, but I think it's because Connive is a very good ability. Constructed in a lot of ways, but even in sealed, where churn, getting through your deck quickly, is a huge priority and very important to do. So all of these ETB Connive things look okay, but this looks like one of the best ones because it can actually be a pretty fat flyer. As far as Broker's Veteran goes, I hate that this isn't an ETB trigger, but dies is still good enough. You are going to be looking to fill out your curve. We call these 22nd and 23rd cards, right? These cards that aren't the best cards in your deck, but for curve purposes, you want a 2-mana creature with 2 power. You need a few of those in your sealed deck typically to fill out your curve. And this is one of the better ones in the set in some ways. Amazingly, it's in blue. You don't see a whole lot of 2-mana, 2-power creatures that provide this kind of value. Putting a shield counter on something when it dies is actually a very big deal, and I think shield counters are going to be incredible in an environment that typically cares about removal, especially when, as I've just said, it doesn't seem like there's as much good or high priority common and uncommon removal in the set as there often is in the sealed environment. So putting shield counters together with a somewhat lack of, relatively speaking, good common and uncommon removal, that's a recipe right there. So, I think these shield counters, and again, the ability to connive are probably worth the bump in casting cost on these creatures. But in this case, as far as this card goes, Broker's Veteran, there's not really a bump in casting cost for the effect of putting a shield counter on something a little bit later in the game. This is great to sacrifice. It's one of the few shield counter things that's great to sacrifice to a Maestro's card, for instance, because then one of your dudes gets a shield counter. That's great. So I really like this little guy a lot. But I also like Obscura Initiate. As far as the stats on this goes, again, it's a Windrake, a 3-mana 2/2 flyer, which is always somewhat playable, but the ability to sometimes gain lifelink depending on what else you're playing is probably going to be important. Lifelink is a pretty good ability in sealed from time to time. So I like this too, as far as, again, when you're looking for sort of generically powerful commons, this one jumps out at me. In terms of uncommons in blue, I also somewhat like Fairy Vandal, but I do like Wingshield Agent and Sleep with the Fishes. Now, Fairy Vandal is just a relatively cheap flyer, and with the Connive ability in this format, I think that it's fairly easy to grow this in sealed, right? So long as you get a few Connive creatures and maybe a couple of other cards that draw you cards, but mostly you want to be playing this alongside Connive creatures, and that will grow this thing fairly easily. I could actually see this being a sort of sleeper pick for sealed, in terms of, like, maybe it might be one of the more important creatures for blue mages in the sealed environment, because I could actually see this being very easy to grow because of Connive, and it grows alongside your Connive creatures. They get big at the same time it does. So just keep an eye out for Fairy Vandal. It could actually be a very important creature in this environment. Wingshield Agent makes me very upset that it doesn't actually have flying. It seems like it should, but it does have a shield counter, and it does give flying to other stuff. And even though a 3-mana 2/3 is not the absolute best rate in the world, I think there's just enough value on this to keep an eye on it. But I also like Sleep with the Fishes because it's probably the best blue removal spell we've seen in sealed in a good long time. Taps the creature down for you. You don't have to wait for it to be tapped. Taps the creature down for you, keeps it tapped forever, and makes an unblockable attacker for you. It's really neat. So this can, again, either basically be an expensive removal spell that creates a body for you to attack with, or you can tap down their best guy and then chump block with the 1/1, and that's kind of good too. So I actually think Sleep with the Fishes is better than it looks, but again, just like with Rumor Gatherer, I really have to point out double color pips in this set, because if you do want to play 3 colors, you don't want to play all of the double colored cards in the world. Now let's move on to black here, and as far as the commons go, I mostly want to talk about the removal, especially considering, again, one more time, it does look to be at somewhat of a premium in this set. But as usual, black has good removal. It's got Murder, which is just always amazing to play in sealed. Even with the double black pips, you probably want to play this card. It's very likely the best removal spell in the set, for all intents and purposes, especially at the lower rarities. But Incriminate is also a spell to keep an eye on. It's not the best edict effect in the world, especially if you're up against a Cabaretti opponent that has a bunch of 1/1 tokens or whatever, so be worried about that. But you still get to choose. Let's say they do have a bunch of 1/1 tokens, and then 2 3/3s. They have to choose one of the 3/3s. You're making them do that. So the way this card is worded does make it a little bit better, but your opponent does still have to have at least the 2 creatures. They won't always. for you to even cast the card. There's a lot of things I don't like about Incriminate, but it is still 2 mana removal and sealed. You're going to play that every single time. Now, I do like Midnight Assassin, if I had to point out a common black creature that I like. This doesn't start with the highest power in the world. I understand that. But it can attack if you wanted to, but it blocks very, very well. It blocks everything in the world, and even though shield counters are in this format, making Death Touch not as good, let's point that out, I still think that a Death Touch flyer, even with 1 power, is worth playing in sealed pretty much every time. Now, in the uncommons, you get Rafine Silencer, Nightclubber, and Graveyard Shift. Now, I wouldn't normally point out Graveyard Shift. This is just kind of a 5 mana reanimation spell, and those aren't actually usually great in sealed, where a lot of times you don't have a 5, 6, 7 drop in your graveyard because you didn't get one in your sealed pool, or you weren't able to drop it in your graveyard, right? It's hard to milkshake in sealed. So, you might just have your 6 drop stuck in your hand, you can't reanimate it, whatever. So reanimator spells aren't usually amazing because you're just going to spend 5 mana to reanimate a 3 drop. That's typically bad, but in this set, there's the Connive ability, so you're going to be dropping things into your graveyard fairly easily and often, I would imagine. There's also the Casualty ability, so you might sacrifice a creature that you really like, and this allows you to get it back, but mostly, I'm looking at Graveyard Shift because there's a baked-in way to discard fat guys on a mechanic in this set, so Graveyard Shift gets a little bit better. But anyway, the other 2 cards are just better cards, right? Like, Nightclubber can come down after combat and finish off a few creatures, or it can just wreck a Cabaretti opponent and blow up all of their 1/1 tokens and stuff, so keep that in mind. Nightclubber is ridiculous. But Rafine Silencer is maybe the best black card in the set, and I kind of am including Mythics and Rares and stuff here. Rafine Silencer is unbelievable. It's a body that basically always kills something, and it's got multiple value points on it. This is just an unbelievable card. I would probably play every copy of this that I got in my pool. Now, red is the only color in which I want to point out more than 3 cards in the common section, because red gets not only Strangle, but also Light 'em Up, and these are 2 of the best removal spells in the sealed meta. Light 'em Up is especially great. Your opponent does have to give up some board presence to do this, but I imagine a Cabaretti opponent's going to sacrifice 1/1 token and take out your 2 actual guys. 2 damage is more than you think it is, and being able to cast Shock twice on the same card is very good. Light 'em Up is a very, very good removal spell. Be on the lookout for it. But Strangle is also great. Just 1 mana, even at sorcery speed. 1 mana for 3 damage is a lightning bolt. And even though it can't go face, it's still, in some ways, next to murder, like the best removal spell in the environment. It's so good. But moving on to actual non-removal spell cards in red. Red's got a couple of good ones at common too. It's got Witty Roast Master and Exhibition Magician, which I love saying. Exhibition Magician is great for the Maestro's decks that want to sacrifice the 1/1. It's great for the Cabaretti decks that just want to go wide, right? So it's good for Riveteers decks that just want, I guess, aggression, which this can provide you as well because of all the bodies. It's basically 3 power on 3 for 3 mana. So there's so many good things about Exhibition Magician, especially at the common level. It's kind of again, signpost common for multiple families, I think, in this set. A Witty Roast Master is much more sort of geared towards the Cabaretti family, right? The Alliance trigger and all that. But this is great reach. I'm not saying you're going to be playing a creature every turn, especially once you're in top deck mode, but this is good reach that if you have a copy, or God forbid, multiple copies of this card out, you can probably do, 3, 4, 5, 6 damage to your opponent over the course of the game. And that's a lot of damage for your 3 drops. So I really like this guy too, and I think as far as lower rarity stuff goes, it's one of the creatures I'm going to be looking for the most in the whole set. But red has really good uncommons too, honestly. I like Call in a Pro, Call in a Professional, Pugnacious Pugilist, which I again love saying, and then Pyre Sledge Arsonist, which I think is sneakily one of the absolute best draft cards in the set, but I'm not too sure about sealed. As far as Call in a Pro, this is just decent removal. You want to probably play this if you get it. Pugnacious Pugilist is effectively 5 power for 5 mana on 2 separate bodies, and you'll get that at least once, but you might get that extra body more than once, which is pretty good. And these devil tokens are always better than we think they are. So 5 mana for a 4/4 is kind of the going rate in sealed anyway. Even with the extra red pip, I still think it's probably worth playing Pugilist a lot. You'll note, I'll say this for the first time, that there aren't actually a lot of giant creatures at lower rarities in this set. So a 5 mana 4/4 is actually even more passable than it often would be, especially one that generates creatures. Pugilist is pretty good. But as far as Arsonist goes, again, very sly here. I think this may be one of the better cards in the set when you pair it not only with Casualty, which is the first thing that should probably come to your mind, but also treasure tokens. There's a number of treasure-producing things in New Capenna, and this goes very well with treasure. Note that it can deal damage to any target equal to the number of things you sacrificed. So that is creatures or planeswalkers or players or whatever. So this thing's ability to maybe block, and when it blocks, tap on a body, that's a very good thing to do. And one last thing, you're not just sacrificing stuff to Casualty. You're not just sacrificing treasure tokens. There's also the sort of evolving wilds lands in this set that sacrifice for free. There's the draw card lands that sacrifice. So there's plenty of ways to sacrifice stuff in this sealed meta. And even though it's very hard to put together tribal decks or sacrifice decks in sealed where you can't control what you get, you just kind of want to put together the most generically good pile that you can a lot of the time and worry about smaller synergies rather than overarching synergies. I do still think that if your sealed pool contains enough things that you can sacrifice, you definitely want to be on this card. But let's look at green here. The commons are in some ways ridiculous, like Prize Fight is a very good common. But there's also Jewel Thief, which is maybe possibly the best common in the set. And then Capenna Express. Now, Capenna Express does not look like it's worth bringing up, but I'll say again here, there just aren't a lot of large creatures at the common rarity in this set. There just aren't. There aren't even a lot of huge creatures. This is bigger than most of the creatures in the set at the rare and mythic rarities. So, and not only that, it's 4 mana, effectively. It's not like it's Colossal Dreadmaw, you have to pay 6 mana for your 6/6, whatever. Now you should have access to 4 mana in your sealed deck, without having to ramp or anything. So, 4 mana is a pretty good call for this. You can sack a treasure to get it going if you want to. Or you can just crew 3, which is kind of a beefy crew cost, but still, a 4 mana 6/6 in a set that just really doesn't have a whole lot of huge creatures is probably worth pointing out. This is kind of a silly looking pick, but I would not be surprised if this actually turned out to be one of the more important commons for limited play in the set, just because of how big it is in a set with a deficit of big creatures, and especially at that mana cost. But there's also Jewel Thief, which again might be the best common in the set, especially for limited play, because it's 3 mana, 3/3. That's all the stats that you want in sealed. But it's also got 2 very good keyword abilities, and it just throws you a treasure. You want to ramp in this environment. You especially want to fix your mana in this environment. This is good for the Riveteers decks that need to play aggressively, but to play aggressively, they need to fix their mana. All right? Like, for instance, like Crew Captain, we looked at it earlier, very aggressively costed, but the chance that you'll have all 3 mana out on turn 3 to play it on curve are much lower than if it was just like 2 and a red, right? So, a thing like Jewel Thief helps you play these, 3 color cards very easily, and it helps you ramp into stuff too. It's just unbelievably good card, and it's better than most of the uncommons in the set, for serious. It's just, Jewel Thief's good. It's good. But Prize Fight is just generically, again, good removal here. That also puts a treasure token into play and is instant speed. You play this card. Now, the uncommons in green are probably going to look a little bit weird at first glance, but trust me, I think these cards are quite good. There's Venom Connoisseur, Freelance Muscle, and Courier's Briefcase. Now, Courier's Briefcase is kind of obvious. This card's good. I wouldn't expect to pay the Wooburg on this card too much, but it is pretty decent in that it gives you the treasure token when it enters play. It's only 2 mana, helps you fix, helps you ramp, all that stuff. And fixing and ramping are the premium in this environment, so I think it's worth playing this card. You also get the 1/1 for sacrificing or just having guys purposes, so that's important too. But Freelance Muscle and Venom Connoisseur look a little bit worse. Again, 5 mana for a 4/4, especially one that's splashable like this. There's only 1 colored pip on the card on Freelance Muscle. I think it's somewhat notable already in this set, but 5 mana for a 4/4 is just kind of ho-hum. It's not really worth bringing up in any sealed environment. It's the fact that this can get bigger, right? I actually think that's very, very important, and on a lot of turns, this is probably going to be the biggest player on the green, or the biggest creature on the green player's side of the table, and it's probably going to be harder to deal with than you might think it is. In some ways, this might end up being the biggest creature in the set on most turns. So keep a lookout for this card. I think it's better than it might appear at first glance. So is Venom Connoisseur, though. Again, you're going to be playing these 2-mana 2/2s, these bears, we call them, to fill out your curve. But this is way better than just filling out your curve, right? Sometimes it can get Death Touch, and then other times it can give your entire team Death Touch, which in Sealed, it's fairly common that ability is akin to win the game, or very, very close to win the game. So you might still have to worry about crackback and all that, but giving your entire team Death Touch and really not making it incredibly hard to do so is actually way better than you might think it is on a creature that you might play anyway. Like, the stats are probably worth playing regardless. And even if it could only give itself Death Touch, it might be okay. But giving your whole team Death Touch is the kind of windfall that wins Sealed games. So keep an eye out for this. It seems fairly bread and butter to me. Now let's quickly look at the other category, which is basically gold and artifacts. But there's only really one artifact that I want to point out, and that's Gildedpinion. I pointed this card out in videos a couple of times recently, so I'm not going to say much about it here. But again, treasure fixes, treasure ramps. You can put this on your bomb and give it flying, so you have like a 6-power flying guy. There's a lot of amazing things about Pinion. Keep an eye out for this. In blue and white, you get Metropolis Angel and Celestial Regulator. In terms of just stats for mana cost, I think Regulator is more than worth playing in Limited, but it also does kind of removal-y tempo things for you, and that's nothing but good. But Metropolis Angel is especially ridiculous looking to me. Connive can put counters on creatures, obviously. The brokers have shield counters, so there's really no shortage of counters going around in this set. And this is one of the better reasons to combine brokers with Obscura here is this card. This is going to draw you a lot of cards over the course of the typical game of Magic, I would imagine. So, Metropolis Angel, really one of the better uncommons in the entire set for sealed play, in my opinion. But there's also Body Dropper and Forge Boss in red-black, so you can play this in Maestros or Riveteers, and they play both well with both of them, especially when you're sacrificing creatures. These are both incredibly good, so they probably work better with Maestros, but again, Riveteers can play Maestros cards and sacrifice creatures to great benefit as well. So both of these cards look good in both of those guilds. Finally, in Gruul, there's Security Rocks and Stimulus Package. Now, Security Rocks is actually going to be kind of great for the rate no matter what you cast it for, right? You cast it for 4 mana. It's still a 5/4. So you still get a great rate for 4 mana, and it's actually one of the most aggressive rates in the entire set. So you just play this card if you get it. But there's also Stimulus Package, which is deceptively decent. It plays pretty well in these Cabaret decks. Plays good with Maestros if you have some sacrifice, some casualty cards, right? Plays somewhat well with Riveteers. Again, they sometimes want to sacrifice. They sometimes want to fix their mana. They sometimes want to ramp because they have expensive cards in Riveteers. They also want to go like pretty aggressive, which you might be able to do by making creatures with the treasure tokens. So there's a lot of reasons to want to play Stimulus Package. Right? The ramp, the color fixing, the guys, you can use any treasures. Like if you do have a pretty solid mana base at the time, you can use any extra treasures to make guys. Just really good card. And I could see this taking over games of Limited in some ways, but not every card. You're going to run out of treasure eventually, right? So, I doubt this makes all the 1/1s in the world. But even though I could see playing this more in draft where you have a little bit more control over what goes into your deck, I still think in Sealed this is probably enough value to end up playing, although it's probably also not one of the best cards in the set. It is probably worth playing a lot of the time, if only to fix your mana. Now, tying up some sort of loose ends and doing a little bit of meta talk here, I don't really know. I can't say, because a lot of people are going to be wanting this. I will give you an answer. But I don't know that I can say objectively what the best family looks like to me. I think that I've been especially supportive of Cabaret cards in this video. I don't think they have the absolute best removal in the world, but they do get to play red, and red has some desirable removal spells in this format. So if I had to lean towards one, it would probably be Cabaret, possibly Riveteers, which I think is the most aggressive guild, and I think that being aggressive is going to be very valuable in the sealed environment. However, I think Riveteers are also kind of stepping on their own toes. They're more aggressive than they can be as a 3-color pile, because again, you can draft the most aggressive or you can get a sealed pool of the most aggressive Riveteers cards in the world, but you might have to play them off curve because you don't have the mana at the right time and all that, and that's not great. I would imagine most aggressive decks in the sealed environment are probably going to be 2 colors, which is something you can do. I mentioned that earlier. But again, I think that because mostly people are going to be trying to force 3 colors, some people are going to be trying to force a 4th color in this environment, I can predict, fairly reliably, that a 2-color aggro deck, if you get the sealed pool for it, could probably do a lot of damage in this environment. Again, if you get the sealed pool for it, if you get the efficient cards for it, you get the correct curve for it. However, this looks like a pretty good sealed environment to be playing 3 colors in. Now, it looks like, especially with a guild that likes to go wide, another guild that likes to give up its own board presence, that there's probably going to be a lot of attrition in this environment. There's also a guild, Obscura, that looks to make its creatures bigger as the game goes on. It needs multiple turns to do that, so that's not necessarily attrition, but it does lend itself to longer formats, right? So I could see, hey, Ziggy, what's up? I could see some games being fairly drawn out in this environment, and that could lend itself, for instance, to a family like Obscura that has some very powerful removal spells and some very powerful, kind of more expensive cards higher up on the curve. The same thing is true in some ways of the Maestro's Guild. Although, I have to say, I don't love the idea of Maestros and sealed. That's coming from someone that loves these sacrifice decks, but this does not look like a sealed environment in which you want to give up a lot of board presence. And as far as brokers go, I think that shield counters are just sort of an obviously very good mechanic in a format like sealed, where removal is like the most important thing, right? So that seems good, but the brokers, if I'm being very honest with you here, and subjective as I can be, not objective at all, the brokers are just kind of a boring guild to me. And I like Bant as a color combination, but just the overall flavor and what they do and how they do it is not something that really interests me as a sealed player, at least. But I will go on the record as saying shield counters are probably busted in a format specifically like sealed. At the end of the day, I'm not trying to cop out, but you do you. Whichever of these fits your play style or just your flavor style, you know, whichever. You're a Grixis player, so you're going Maestros. Like, do that. But I'm going to pre-release, and I am probably picking Cabaretti is the one that I'm leaning towards, but I have a feeling that that's not correct. But in an environment that looks somewhat slower, more plotting, mana matters, and therefore having cards that are, you know, monocolored, easier to cast, generically powerful, cards that put multiple creatures on the battlefield at the same time, color combination with decent removal that can still play decent creatures, and hit its theme reliably in an environment like sealed, I think Cabaretti hits all of those marks, so that's the one I'm going for personally. However, I'll say again that Obscura is very tempting. A lot of flying creatures, very good removal in those color combinations, and being able to combine some of the, you know, broker stuff to put shield counters on my big connive guys that, you know, I spend all game getting huge. Again, very tempting. So I'm kind of between Cabaretti and Obscura in terms of which 2 guilds I like the most or which families I like the most in sealed. But again, that's it for this one. If you liked it, go ahead and like the video. That would mean a lot, especially if this video helps you at your pre-release at all. Come back and leave me a comment. Like the video if you haven't liked it by then. That would mean a lot to me. Share it around so more people can get some semblance of strategy before pre-release. A lot of content creators haven't done this in a long time. But aside from that, sub to the channel if you enjoyed the content and you want to see more of it, because we've got top 25 next couple of days. I'll be rating the entire set on Twitch. I have the internet back. I have AT&T fiber optic, you know, internet, which is apparently very good. At least that's what the AT&T people said, but that's what they would say. But, you know, we're going to have top 25 coming up, Deck Techs after that, Dank Jank, so sub to the content if you haven't done that yet. But now I'm going to get out of here, everybody. Make sure you have fun at your pre-release. Enjoy Paper Magic again, or possibly for the first time, and maybe I'll see you there. I'll catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.